What's up, summoners? King Blair here. With the Epic 7th anniversary coming to a close, we have a ton of new 5-stars in our accounts, whether it be from the 5-star selector, from the 5-star summon ticket, or from the 70 summon event that they just did. These heroes are sitting in our box right now, and you may be feeling very, very overwhelmed with all the heroes that you have to build and work towards to progress your account. So what we're going to be talking about today is talking how to approach building your heroes and which heroes should you be focusing on. So how this video will roll out is first, general tips on approaching how to build a hero. Some things that will help you not feel as overwhelmed overall in the game. Then we'll talk about the different stages in the game and what the goals are for those stages so that you know what things you should be looking for in the heroes that you're actually trying to build. And then last but definitely not least, I will give you some tips and some recommendations for heroes that you can 5-star or 6-star and put resources into if you have them in your box to help you throughout all the different phases of the game. So if you like the video, make sure you like, subscribe, and join the Discord server. Link down in the description. But without further ado, let's get right into it. So first, starting with the tips on approaching building heroes. And this is something that even myself and a lot of different late game players, if you're one of these, let me know in the comments. But it's something that everyone kind of struggles with a little bit, is approaching who do I build? Because this game is actually very, very generous. And there are a lot of heroes that you have to decide what resources are going to heroes. Who are you going to put the gear on? Who are you giving the catalyst? Who are you actually going to be 6-starring? And the biggest mistake that people make, including myself, as I mentioned, is going to be that we try to build too many heroes at the same time because all these heroes look amazing. The problem with that becomes that Epic 7 is a very resource limited game. You have things like gold resource, gear resource, catalyst resource, and Molagora resources that can stop the progression of your character builds, which is why you see a lot of people have tons and tons and tons of 5-star heroes. So it's important that you don't focus all over the place, but that you actually have a plan on who are you going to build and what you're going to be using them. So kind of summarize that point, big thing you want to do when you're approaching building heroes is have a plan for the hero that you're using, and don't focus on every single unit that you have. Focus on the units that you need. And that's why we're going to be talking about that in just a second. But the other one is also have a plan. So let me give you an example of things with a plan and things without a plan. So let's look at my Kise, right? And this is an example of something that I did not so great, right? Kise, I 6-starred her. I didn't give her catalyst thankfully, but let's assume that I gave her catalyst. I'm doing all this stuff. I 6-starred her, but I don't actually have a plan for her. All I know is that Kise is a good unit for PvP, but I didn't think about how I'm going to draft her, how I'm going to use her in PvP, where am I going to use her in PvP, and the biggest question, do I even have the gear to use for Kise, right? And the answer is no. I don't have the gear for her right now. So I shouldn't have even approached her, right? That's something you have to do before you even start doing your units, or you're going to be like getting to a point where they're 6-star and you're sitting there, you're like, I actually can't use this unit that I put all my time and love into because I just don't have the gear or the resources for her, right? So that's something definitely that is account by account. That is something that you'll have to gauge with the current gear that you have, whether you can make a unit or not, which is what I started doing, is actually putting the gear on the unit before I actually built them. So if we look, for example, at my martial artist Ken, he actually has the set that I would have used on him if I did decide to build him, right? And that's just from the spare gear, and I was like, oh, I actually do have the pieces, right? So have a plan for how you're going to be using it. So that's a good way to do it. And another unit is someone like Mercedes, who I'm starting to build more in depth. When you look at Mercedes, I have a plan for her. I know I'm a Bruiser player. I want her for RTA because I'm a late game player. I know I need to do PvP late game. So that's why I'm going to be Mercedes. I have the gear for her. I was missing one piece, and that's why I farmed the gear for her. So now I can actually commit a lot of the resources since I have a plan and I know what I'm doing with her. And that is very important when approaching building units in Epic 7, because you don't want to be overwhelmed by all the amazing units that are out there. And you'll end up with scenarios like myself where I have Surmia and Pavel sitting there with resources, and I don't use either of those units where I could have 6-starred a unit and actually be using them, right? So that's going to be the general tips. So first, focus on a few units that you know you're gonna be using, and have a plan for the units that you're actually going to be using before you actually commit all the resources to them. So with that out of the way, now you may be thinking, well, that's cool and all, but what if I don't even know what I want, right? So if you don't actually know what you want, let's talk about the different stages of the game to help you decide on what you need. So first, let's talk really quickly about the early game. The early game is when you're first starting Epic 7, you probably cleared the first adventure, you probably cleared 1010, and you're probably getting your Arbiter Villager because, as we've talked about in another video, he's probably the best unit you can get from that ML selector. But let's say you did all that, and you're just trying to get to Wyvern 13. Well, that is the early game. You're still very early in the game. You don't have almost anything, right? You're the very early phases of the game. Resources are scarce, and there is a ton of stuff going your way. For the early game, the main things you are going to want to focus on are going to be PvE, particularly building your Wyvern 13 team, right? That's the number one priority, and that should be where almost all your resources are going to be going towards, is building your Wyvern 13 team, right? That is priority number one, because you can't build any other hero until you clear Wyvern 13. Another thing you want to start thinking about but not actually committing to is a Banshee hunt, right? Start researching, start saying, okay, do I want to build stuff like that, right? Is that something I want to do? So the biggest goal of early game is actually to get your Wyvern 13 team, but you also don't want to ignore PvP. So for PvP, you're going to want to start focusing on Arena as well a little bit, right? You want to at least try to get to, I believe it's Master that you have to get to, so that you can actually max awaken your Arbiter Villager, right? So you want to focus primarily on finishing Wyvern 13 and a little bit on doing Arena. My recommendation for Arena, and I'll talk about more specific about the units in a second, but for Arena, typically you want to go with an aggressive team. While boosters can work, and that's definitely something you can do if that's something you want to be thinking more about RTA, and maybe you don't like an aggressive playstyle, you do need to start thinking about that. So units like RB that are really good at doing damage, that you get for free, pretty easy to build with the free attack set that they give you, and we'll go into more in depth for those early game heroes. But those damage dealing units, something like Hekra that's very flexible that you can use here, and you can potentially also use for Wyvern, right? So that's another really, really good option for you to use. And if you have any type of support type units, like a Bassar that can help you set up, maybe if you go in more the Bruiser like an Amelia, we'll talk about more about those units in a second. But again, just try to get your team in Arena built, and there's a lot of different options that you have to go, but just I would recommend something more aggressive, something that's actually going to take turn one and it's actually going to try to cleave the defense, right? Using RB is the one unit I can tell you for sure. So that's going to be what you're doing in the early game. Now, as far as the mid game, for the mid game, you have already completed your Wyvern 13. You have a good amount of gear in your account. You're starting to compete a little bit more in Arena. You've made it to Masters in Arena at least, right? You're starting to get into the real meat and potatoes of Epic 7, and this is actually where you have the lowest resource, right? Because you lost all the resources you have from early game. Now you're in the mid game. So what you should be focusing right now is going to be more advanced PvE content. PvE is still a very big priority because that is going to be how you're going to be getting your resources. So for this one, you really want to start thinking about how you're going to be clearing Banshee 13. Do you have the units to do a Banshee 13 one-shot? If you don't, then consider looking videos on how to do slow Banshee clears, right? Things like Falconeer Clury, things like Violet, that can help you try to get past those sections and can help you actually clear this effectively, right? Or even things like Blaze Dingo that actually do work in things like Banshee. Right, so you do want to start thinking about things like Banshee, thinking about things like Asima Hunt. You really want to start doing Abyss and Labyrinth. And Labyrinth and Abyss, you should try to build the same units, and those are going to be very staples. Right, so here is where you're going to be building the staples for all PvE and PvP content, because you're also going to be starting to get into things like Guild War, and even maybe starting to dip your feet into RTA. So that's going to be kind of when you're in the mid game, right? So biggest priority for a mid game player is going to be to focus on this higher end PvE content like Labyrinth, Abyss, the other 13 hunts, as well as Guild Wars, because you're starting to focus on those things. So you're going to be building a lot of priority units. This is probably the most boring part because there's a lot of staples that you just have to build, right? These are just things that you're going to naturally have to build if you want to be competitive in Epic 7 and if you want to be able to progress your account easier, right? And then last but definitely not least, the late game. This is where you already have teams for all your PvE content. You already cleared that, right? You already cleared the hurdle of PvE. You're probably late game Abyss, like 90, 100, and you're starting to really get into Arena and RTA. You're like Challenger in Arena. You're trying to get to Masters in RTA, and you're trying to join a top level guild, right? That is going to be the late game. This one is the one that's going to be very up in the air because this one is going to be playstyle dependent. If you're someone that's already committed to a certain type of playstyle, then there's certain units that you're going to have to be focusing on. But again, there are some staples that if you didn't already build them, you should be building them. So with all the different stages in Epic 7 in mind, let's actually look at some recommendations for units to focus on and to build when you're doing Epic 7. So first, for the early game, again, your biggest priority is finishing Wyvern 13. You should have re-rolled your account for a Sigrid, right? Hopefully. She's going to probably be one of your earliest 5/6 star units because you should have started the game with her, right? She is just an incredibly good unit, and she's going to be the one that's going to be carrying you in things like Wyvern, right? And I do suggest you look at other Wyvern guides, but kind of basing off of that, again, focusing on the Wyvern type units. So another thing would be your frontliner, right? The frontliner, it really depends. If you have a Crawl that you think can actually tank effectively, I would suggest it. But if you don't have a Crawl, or you don't think you're having problems tanking the Wyvern, I actually suggest going with either a Montmorency or with an Angelica. I actually think going for Montmorency being the better of the two options. Why should you be going for Angelic Montmorency? Well, because not only can she tank frontline Wyvern for you, she can also very effectively work for a lot of different PvE content that will help you progress your account a lot quicker, right? So if you're an early game player and you don't have a General Purgus because you probably don't have the gear quality for that, you can definitely use something like Angelic Montmorency. She will be useful very, very deep into your game for a very, very long time. So it's another really good unit for you to focus on if you don't already have been focusing on her. As far as other units that you should be focusing on at this point, is going to be none other than Arbiter Vildred that you should be getting when you clear 1010. Why should you be focusing on Arbiter Vildred? Well, because you're going to be using him in every stage of the game, right? He's good in every single content, in PvP and Arena, and you are going to want to start winning a little bit more in Arena. As far as to other things that you can use, as we mentioned in Arena, you have to kind of start deciding if you want to do more Bruiser, more aggressive. I suggest more aggressive just so you don't spend that much time in Arena. But if you're not, again, Crawl is a very, very good option, and you probably had the chance to get him earlier on with that 5-star selector. Very, very good option. Will be very nice for you. If you got one of the units like Violet from one of your 5 stars, he's also a really solid unit because he'll also be useful later on in PvP and in other higher level content. So if you do have him, he's also good for early Arena just because he's able to dodge and just get you wins like it's nothing. But again, you want to be playing more aggressive, or if you're playing more Bruiser, those are some other options. So you need to be focusing on damage dealers. There's a bunch of different damage dealers that I could talk about, but I would stay away from the assassins like Kise, right? So if you really like Kise, I would not be going for her because she is very hard to build. So you want to focus on units that are slightly easier to build and can get you those wins in Arena. So now that we talked about the early game, let's talk about more when you're getting to the mid game. For mid game players, this is time to build your staples. If you haven't already, you should be doing this. For early game players, hopefully you haven't left the video yet because you also need to know this. But this is the time that you need to be building your staples, and you should have your staples built already, and you need to be focusing on your staples, right? Who are some of the staples that I'm going to be talking about? Well, for one, you have someone like Falconeer Cleary. The other reason why I'm going to be mentioning these staples is because for the 3 stars, for example, Falconeer Cleary, they don't require Molagora, right? So they're very good units to work on when you're low on Molagora from some of the other heroes that we're going to talk about. So Falconeer Cleary, incredible in every single content in the game, PvE, PvP, Abyss, everywhere, right? So you definitely want to start working on her. She's going to be one of the staples. Ross, you should be getting later into the game, hopefully being able to clear episode 2-2. He's also another unit you really want to start working on for a staple just because he's so incredible for PvE. The other staple that you should have, right? If you've been playing in here, you should have this unit, Tamarine. Because we just got the selector, you have to be building her right now. She's literally going to carry you everywhere in PvE. She should be number 1 priority if you're trying to progress in PvE, right? So Tama, for sure, another staple that you should have because you just use the selector. That's another really good unit you should definitely be working on. Some other staples that you can also start thinking if you want to get more competitive in Guild Wars, something like a Doris. That's also pretty good for RTA, since you do have to start thinking about that, or an Acades, who again is also an incredibly good unit for Guild Wars, right? So, and of course the Crawl that we talked about, if you did get the Crawl, again, another staple, right? These are just staple units. Some other units that you couldn't really get from the 5-star selector, but things like Fallen Cecilia, another incredible unit to be working on because again, it's just a staple type unit. They're just units that you're going to be using a lot of the time, right? So those are going to be some of the staples you should really be focusing. And then as far as DPSs and supports, you also need to start thinking about building some of those for higher level arena and for RTA. Some of the options you have available, things like Charlotte are really, really good. Things like Rem are incredible, right? If you did manage to pull a Rem recently from the collab, very good staple to have, just helpful all across all PvE. Violet, as we mentioned, another really, really good staple. He's the 5-star Thief hero, so I couldn't see him because I'm not on Thief side. But Violet, another really good DPS staple. Something like a Carrot, again, another 3-star. Again, staple for all PvE content. And of course, you don't want to neglect your PvE. So for Abyss, you have to decide if you're going to be doing Poison Cheese, and most likely you are. So you at this point should start considering getting a Curious, right? Because she's really just makes climbing Abyss significantly easier. I know it's annoying, but that's an option. If you don't like Curious, you can also go for something like a Fire Shuri to help you with things like Abyss. But again, once you build those staples, you should be on your way to clearing most PvE content, and they work for the majority of the PvE content, right? And I didn't talk about some of the other DPSs, but things like Landy, I know she didn't get a banner recently, but she's also a really, really good unit. And of course, Iseria, if you do have an Iseria with your Tamarine, another staple to work on. I know I just said a lot of different heroes, but those are the ones that you should really be focusing on. And I don't know if you noticed, but most of them were not our ML heroes, right? Because you need to be able to be clearing your PvE, and a lot of the staples work for both PvE and PvP, which is what makes them so freaking good in the game. If you're doing Banshee, things like Leo is going to be really nice if you don't for one shot. But if you're not doing a one shot, Falconeer Cleary really helps out a ton. And of course, having a grass DPS, you can use a Sid, Landy. And I just said a Sid, but I meant regular Sid. Really, really good option as well, because it also transitions very nicely into your Earth Expedition. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on this because there are so many options, but you do want to focus on those finishing PvE options and staples that are going to transition to the late game. So now, as far as late game, this is probably the part that you have the most flexibility in things that you can do. And I can't really make a recommendation because it is just very dependent on your playstyle, right? If you're someone that is planning to play Bruiser, right? Some staples would be things like Charlotte, would be things like Emilia and Ruel, right? Some of these higher end Soul Weavers that are really good at PvP. DN, right? That's if you're a Bruiser, right? You need those staple DPSs, the Rem that we talked about that you should probably have build. Things like Seaside. I know I didn't mention her, but again, there's so many good units in this game that you can see why it's such a complicated thing. At this time, you can also start thinking of more specific if you're planning on cleaving, right? And that's something I didn't mention before. If you are a cleaver, things like your Flan, right? If you have a Flan, things like your Cerise, things like your Oxlots, your Sedom, right? This is the part that you really want to start thinking about what playstyle you want to play, right? And I recommend you stick with one playstyle. Don't make the mistake. If you're someone that has a lot of Bruiser gear in your account and you don't have any speed gear, there's no reason to focus on cleave units, right? And I know that's very sad and frustrating, especially if you like some of the way that some units are designed. But let's talk, for example, about Pavel. If you have no support for Pavel and no gear for Pavel, because all your gear is Bruiser and all the units that Smilegate gave you are Bruisers, you probably shouldn't be building him unless you really want to have fun with him, right? So again, depending on your playstyle, that's going to decide what unit you are going to be building. But again, starting to think PvP centered, right? Units that are really, really meta. And I will definitely release a RTA tier list to give you guys an idea. But again, have a plan and do all that. But with that, now let's go to a quick summary on everything we talked about. So to summarize, have a plan for the unit that you're using. Have something that you are working towards. It is very, very resource wasteful if you have zero plan and if you're just dumping resources on heroes that you're not even going to be using on in the future, right? And I definitely have made the mistake. Again, my account does not have a lot of aggressive gear. All these catalysts that I put on Pavel, completely wasted. I'm not using him, right? So this could have been another unit that could have helped my account progress a lot more. Something like, for example, my Cecilia, who I don't use, who I honestly could, but again, I didn't have a plan for her, right? It's not that I don't like her. It's just I have no plan for her. I never find myself ever using her. So it's just wasted resources. But again, at the end of the day, what's most important about Epic 7 is that you are having fun and progressing your accounts. So if you really like a waifu or a husband character, even if they're not helping progress your accounts, by all means, you can definitely build them. That's the main goal of Epic 7 anyway. But hopefully these tips help you tackle some of the different content that you are struggling with. And more specific, I will definitely have to go more. There's a lot more that could be said, but I don't want this video to be like a 40-minute video. So I'm going to stop right there. If you have any questions of anything that you're wondering of who you should be building, let me know in the comments and I'll try to get to them. But that is all I have for you guys today, and I will see you next time. Peace.